influencing popular culture, politics, and everything in between. The local station takes you ringside as we discuss the crazy world that is professional wrestling. This is Going Ringside with the local station.
Hello there, and thank you for joining us for Going Ringside. I'm your host, Scott Johnson. So glad you could be back here with us today as we talk to Cain. Glenn Jacobs, you also know him as, going to be joining us in a little bit on the show. So this is kind of the end of our 3-episode arc that we got at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. So 2 episodes ago, as you know, I brought you maybe the only wrestling podcast in history to bring you an interview with Linda McMahon, episode 73, last 2 weeks ago. You can go look at it right now. Last week, we talked about all those wrestling speeches during the Republican National Convention. We played Hulk Hogan's speech, talked to Dana White, heard again from Linda. And the one that I've been saving that I was excited for is a one-on-one with Cain. Also now heavily in touch, Republican politician. By in touch, I mean with the National Party. He's pretty big in the National Party. He is currently the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, which is essentially the Knoxville area, one of the main hubs of Tennessee in that state. And we'll get to his politics in a bit because we talk about both in this interview because Glenn Jacobs, the man, is one of the few pro wrestlers ever to successfully navigate politics. To my knowledge, there's only been 3 with a few failures. Of course, and we've talked about it here on the show, Jesse the Body Ventura was governor of Minnesota, elected in the late 1990s, served 1 term, decided not to run again. He's still kind of been a guy talked about in political circles. Linda McMahon, who we had on 2 weeks ago, ran for Senate twice, lost twice, but was inducted into former President Trump's cabinet as the head of the Small Business Administration. She served there for a few years. And then you've got Cain. He is a 2-term mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, meaning he won his original election and his re-election. A few others have toyed with it. I know Booker T, who we had on the show, once talked about running for mayor of Houston. I think Rhino ran for office at one point, if you remember Rhino from ECW. And Bob Backlund. I want to say Bob Backlund ran for Congress, but Cain has been the guy who's had a lot of success at it. And frankly, he's kind of been big with the Republican Party. We're going to analyze his career path as far as politics in a little while, but he's in big with like former President Trump, so that ought to tell you that he's kind of well established in the GOP politics. Talk about that in a bit. But we need to talk about his wrestling career. That's likely why you're here. Glenn Jacobs, the man, tries out a few crummy gimmicks in his early career, very famously. So he'd had some independent work, but eventually he's picked up by the World Wrestling Federation in the mid-1990s and came in with one of the most famous, horrible gimmicks ever. It's pretty much widely panned as a bad gimmick. He was brought in, kind of managed by Jerry Lawler, as an evil dentist named Isaac Yankem DDS. No disrespect to Britt Baker over in AEW, who's a real dentist, but a dentist that is a character? No one really quite are we supposed to be afraid of the dentist? I know people don't like to go to the dentist, but he was not just a dentist. He was like this monster. He had bad teeth. He looked like he was 7 feet tall and was brought in as a big monster. And I personally, as a wrestling fan, I always loved the big monsters. But he was a dentist. We're like, what is this? And I know WWF in the mid-90s was doing a lot of occupation gimmicks with IRS, the Repo Man, and Isaac Yankem DDS. He had a bit of a run, I want to say, with like Bret Hart, but it didn't go very far. Eventually, WWF came to realize that a battling dentist, even though he's evil and scary, is kind of a gimmick. Where do you go with that? So they repackaged Glenn Jacobs in kind of a famous angle, because if you remember in 1996, famously, Scott Hall, Razor Ramon, and Diesel, Kevin Nash, jump ship and go to WCW. And they formed the NWO. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a whole nother episode. We can talk about that later. But when Hall and Nash left WWF as a company was left with a big hole. They lost 2 of their big characters, and they went to the other company and were kind of portraying themselves as invading WCW, which I think spawned a lawsuit against WCW because they were kind of infringing on copyright. You were portraying them as WWF characters, even though not directly saying it. There was some legal battle between the two companies. I don't want to talk about that. But what I do want to talk about is one thing WWF did to replace Diesel and Razor Ramon is they had this odd idea. It appears run by Jim Ross, who was on episode 1 of Going Ringside, to bring in a fake Diesel and a fake Razor Ramon to kind of just replace them. They own the characters. Why not just bring them back with different guys playing the characters? Didn't work. Fans were confused. Fans saw through it. They thought it was stupid. Didn't last very long. That being said, the guy they got to play Diesel was Glenn Jacobs. They dyed his goatee black. They gave him black hair. He's roughly the same size as Kevin Nash, so he could kind of pull off that Diesel. But fans were like, this is not Diesel. This is some other guy dressed up as him. So it didn't work. So keep in mind, Glenn Jacobs is there a couple years. He's had 2 failing gimmicks that were, by most accounts of wrestling fans, awful gimmicks. Isaac Yankem and Diesel, fake Diesel. But WWF didn't give up on him. Most guys, after a bad gimmick or two, might wash out. Not Glenn Jacobs. They saw star power. They saw they had something. Then, third time's a charm. Because in what many regard as the greatest wrestling storyline, full-on scripted story ever, happens in the mid-90s when you have The Undertaker. Undertaker, by this point, is established as the backbone of the locker room. He's beaten everyone. No one can compete with him. So eventually they try and give Undertaker more story, more background. They have him feud with Mick Foley as Mankind. Mankind, go watch our old show with Mick Foley we had on a few weeks ago. He was a great interview. And along the way, Paul Bearer, Undertaker's on-again, off-again manager, says, I've found Cain. Cain is alive. We're like, who's Cain? So Cain, which actually was ironically Undertaker's original name when he first came in the early 90s, they called him Cain the Undertaker. That's another story. But they say Undertaker has a long-lost brother who he thought was dead that allegedly had been burned in a fire along with Undertaker and Cain's parents. He's brought in as this almost demonic monster to feud with The Undertaker, who was also his own version of supernatural. And when they brought in Cain in the red and black mask, he was arguably the most indestructible wrestler we'd ever seen in the World Wrestling Federation. He came in and he destroyed everyone. People would beat on him. They couldn't touch him. He would destroy Vader. He would destroy Ahmed Johnson. I think he destroyed the Road Warriors at one point. Cain was this indestructible monster, and it eventually built to him and Undertaker facing off at a WrestleMania. But after that was over, unlike a lot of feuds for Undertaker, Cain didn't fall by the wayside. He remained a headliner during the Attitude Era, which was peak WWE. The most popular it had ever been was in the Attitude Era. He was on top. You had guys like Austin, Rock, Triple H, Foley, Undertaker, and Cain. And Cain remained a major force. And eventually, as the years went by, he continued to be a major force in the company. They took the mask off, and he was in all sorts of storylines for years and years and years and years. You had Undertaker, who was a fixture in the company for like 20 plus years. Cain was not far behind. I think he was a primary character in WWF, WWE for like around 20 years, maybe a little more. And he was a great commodity because they could make him be whatever they needed him to be. He could go out and put over a top guy and be believable as this indestructible monster. They could put the title on him. They could have him do other stuff. They could have him backstage vignettes. He eventually did a movie where he played another monster in a movie. He was a useful tool for the World Wrestling Federation, WWE eventually, because he was nearly 7 feet tall, a monster, and he was believable. Everyone knew his backstory. He's Undertaker's brother. A lot of people believe they were actual brothers. They're not. So eventually, Cain just becomes kind of an iconic figure in the company until he finally kind of steps away from wrestling and tries out politics, which was kind of an odd juxtaposition for wrestling fans. They're like, Mayor Cain? Like, you can think of different, wrestlers who you might think of politicians, but Kane was like this indestructible monster in the ring. And now he's wearing a tie and he's a politician, which he remains to this day. Very big in the Republican Party. At the Republican convention where we talked to him, he was a high-profile politician, arguably, I would say, one of the 5 most famous mayors in the country, maybe top 2 alongside, the mayor of New York, because he was globally famous before he was elected, and he has a lot of political power behind him. Do not think that Glenn Jacobs' political career is over, even though he's in his 2nd term and soon to be term limited out as mayor. There may be more coming for Glenn Jacobs. We'll talk about that after the interview. I want to break down and analyze his political career. But I want to get to the interview because I was so excited for him to be here with us on episode 75, a monumental show, so we wanted to have a monumental guest. Here is our interview with Mayor of Knox County, Glenn Jacobs. You know him better as Cain. Well, we're overjoyed to be joined by the Mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, Glenn Jacobs, or as many of you might know him a little better, Cain. Mayor Jacobs, thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me on, Scott. I appreciate it.
Talk to me all about, we're at the Republican National Convention right now. You, of course, heavily involved in Tennessee Republican politics.
Yeah.
How did the political turn for you happen?
Oh, man, I've been interested in politics all my life. I never really wanted to hold elected office. But nevertheless, if you know my life story, I grew up on a farm in Missouri, and my family didn't have a whole lot, and I was able to live the American dream, and I just want to make sure that is alive for my kids and my grandkids.
So you are one of 2, I believe, WWE Hall of Famers here at the event, the other one being President Trump.
Yeah, good point. Good point, yes.
Who is here right now.
He may be the more important one.
Yeah. Possibly, but you both are very important.
Yeah.
I've seen you have worked a lot with President Trump. I've seen some rallies. Talk to me about some of the interaction you guys have had.
Yeah, so obviously knew him a little bit back from days in WWE.
Which I want to get to, but
yes,
go ahead.
Okay, but and just kind of through various connections and everything. He's in person, he is a very friendly, extremely gracious person. I've met him at the golf course in Bedminster. Been to a couple rallies. Sure. And just very gracious, very friendly individual.
And you guys did kind of get to know each other because he had the life before politics, as did you.
Right.
What was that dynamic like when he was in WWE?
Right. So he actually helped promote the first few WrestleManias.
Yeah.
Going way, way back. He also, obviously, when UFC was in its infancy, helped there as well. He's a big fan of sports and combat sports, I think, especially. But it's from that perspective, and it's kind of cool to be able to reconnect after years of both of us being out of that game.
Now, my most recent guest on the show is going to be a familiar name to you. It was Mick Foley. We just had Mick on the show.
Sure.
He was one of your feuds when you first started. What was it like when you first started? You came in with just a totally different gimmick than anything we'd ever really seen before.
Yeah, the Cain character was amazing. I'd had a couple failed runs, and then Cain came along. The debut, in my opinion, many people's opinion, is the greatest of all time.
Yeah.
Not my doing, is actually, the plate was just set perfectly for me, but having the opportunity to wrestle Undertaker and that whole storyline and then going on from there, I was just blessed to have an incredible career in WWE.
Were you and Taker just essentially the same size?
Yeah, we're very close. Yes.
Really?
A lot of people think that we're our brothers outside the ring because we look alike. We're virtually the same size. So.
Did you bond over the years?
Oh, yeah. He was instrumental in just helping me in WWE. Our first match was actually in Smoky Mountain Wrestling in Knoxville.
Was that with Jerry Lawler's territory?
No, that was Jim Cornette.
Jim Cornette,
yeah,
okay.
Lawler's
yeah.
on the other side of the state. Lawler's West Tennessee.
Okay.
So we're in East Tennessee. But what's really cool now is my office in Knoxville literally looks over the Civic Center, which are the Coliseum, Civic Coliseum, which is where we had our first ever match. But through the years, he helped me out tremendously. He was a mentor to mine, and he's become a very good friend.
I want to talk to you about a little the confluence of wrestling and politics, which we've seen a lot over the years. Let's start with right here, right now. President Trump being involved. We're seeing Dana White, I think, is going to be one of the speakers here.
Sure.
It really seems to, since the Trump presidency, these two worlds have kind of aligned almost.
Well, I think it's more than that. It's just people that care about our country and want to make a difference. And you see that through all walks of life. And I don't think that sports or wrestling are any different.
You saw the closeness of the McMahon family and the Trump family for years. Were they always close?
Oh, yeah. As I said, Trump helped promote the first couple WrestleManias. Of course, they had Battle of Billionaires at WrestleMania in Detroit. So, yes, they've been pretty close throughout the years.
Have you had to answer questions on any of the McMahon drama at all?
Not really. I mean, I haven't been there for 5 years.
Sure. Keep it away from it.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
So, what do you hope this year? I mean, this will air before we get to the election. Are you going to continue hot on the campaign trail?
As much as I can. I think it's imperative with our country and the state that it is in that we get Donald Trump back in the White House.
I think I saw a statement from you, I saw a quote from you in the last few days with respect to the attempted assassination.
Yeah.
You comparing him to Brock Lesnar, former President Trump, with the raised fist and stuff like that.
Right. I have been around tough, strong men my entire life. Played football, basketball, sports, obviously over 20 years in WWE. And the fact that a guy can have bullets whiz by his head, get hit in the ear, and it doesn't faze him at all. It's just amazing. In fact, he got up, he was ready to fight. I've just never seen anything like that before. And that shows you the kind of person that he is. And we make an age an issue in this campaign. The guy's 78 years old, and he still gets up and he's literally fighting with the Secret Service to get his shoes back on. Just the most amazing thing that I've ever seen, that single-minded determination and defiance. It's just amazing to me.
Now, you have gone out of wrestling where you're kind of silent, and now you're in a position where you have to talk a lot more.
Right.
Has that been a hard transition for you?
No, well, actually, throughout my career, there were times I didn't talk. There were times I did talk a lot. So, no, it's not. I mean, obviously, this is in a different way, for sure. But WWE helped in many respects as far as, public speaking was one of those things. I mean, WWE, you have to go out sometimes and almost on the spur of the moment be able to speak in front of 20,000 people, and there's no room for error. It's one take and you go. So that's one of the things I think that really helped me. I don't have that fear of public speaking. A lot of people do, just because I did it for so long. I remember one time I was Jesse Ventura had just been elected governor of Minnesota, and I was watching whatever news show it was, and they said he'd done a great job in the debates, and someone said, well, for professional wrestling, he did a great job. He was a color commentator for years and years and years. His job, 2 hours every week, was to talk for 2 hours. So that really does in that way prepare us, or at least me, for a skill that's translatable to what I do now.
Now, before we go, I want to ask where you're at politically. You are in your second term right now.
Yes, yeah.
What long reign? Any idea where things are going to go for you?
A lot. So much is going to depend on what happens in the elections in November. And I think that we're all looking at that, and a lot of us will make decisions about where we go based on what happens there. I am term limited, so I have about a little over 2 years left, so I have a while before I make that decision. But so much, is focused on that. And right now my objective is just to help Donald Trump become the next president of the United States.
One thing, if that does happen and he calls on your services, would you be willing to step up?
You don't say no to the president.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Mayor Glenn Jacobs, a.k.a. Kane, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you so much.
So I want to thank Glenn Jacobs, Kane, for coming on. And pretty soon in the show, we're going to have a new podcast from Florida called the Chutes and Ladders Podcast. Stay tuned for that. I want to talk to them in a bit, and we'll get to why they're important in a little bit. But I want to go over some of the things going on with Kane, particularly political. So in my other job, I'm a news anchor and a political reporter for Channel 4 in Jacksonville. So I kind of wanted to help you analyze what you need to watch for Glenn Jacobs if he decides to stick with politics, which is very possible. So he's going to be term limited out of the mayor job in a couple years. What do a lot of high-profile mayors do? They run for other offices. So what you want to watch for, if you're kind of wondering what happens to Kane, is what happens in the November election. I'm going to get political for a minute, but bear with me because I want to explain to you what might happen with Kane. And it really depends on what happens with the presidential election, because there are a few jobs he could run for in Tennessee where he's extremely high profile, probably the third or fourth most high profile politician in Tennessee. You have a governor, Republican. You have 2 senators who are Republicans, and below that you have some Congress people. So if Kamala Harris is the nominee and wins, things kind of remain the same in Washington, D.C. No Tennessee politicians would move to D.C. It'd probably remain as it is right now. So you would have to look at, could he run for governor? Bill Lee, the governor there, I think is term limited out the same time Cain is. I don't know that the senators would go anywhere. Maybe he runs for Congress. Those are some options if Kamala Harris wins. If Donald Trump wins as president, then it gets a little more interesting. First, Trump has shown a history of putting WWE people in his cabinet. He put Linda McMahon there. I'm not saying he'd put Cain there, but they've done rallies together. He seems to like Glenn Jacobs, so that's possible. But what may be more likely is if Trump were president, he might pull some of those Tennessee politicians into his cabinet, like one of the senators or maybe the governor. At that point, a spot opens up, and Cain may run, Glenn Jacobs may run from one of those spots. So pay attention to what happens in November. If Harris wins, Jacobs would need someone to drop out or resign or an available position to run for. If Trump wins, he could maybe take some of those top-level Tennessee politicians to Washington, and Cain may have a political avenue. These are just some things to watch if you're into politics, which I know we've talked a lot about here the last few weeks, but that may be what happens with him if he continues politically. So we will be monitoring here at Going Ringside. And I do want to say on the political thing, I want to wrap this up. We've done a lot of politics in the last 3 weeks because we got so much content at the Republican National Convention, and obviously Cain, Linda McMahon showing the speeches last week. We're not trying to be a political show, and we're going to get away from that here in coming weeks, back to normal. But we had all this stuff. I wanted to bring it to you. I will be at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in a few weeks. If anything pops up from a wrestling nature, we'll probably bring it back. But just so you're aware, why they've been talking about politics so much. That's why. But I want to change topics, and I want to talk to a new podcast based in Florida. So I'm based in Jacksonville, as you know, home of AEW, and I'm on wrestling social media all the time. And I think I'm going through Instagram at one point, and I see this new podcast out there called the Chutes and Ladders Podcast, and it looked to me like it was from my neck of the woods. It has a male and female host. And I looked into it, the female from Jacksonville, the male from South Florida. So it's essentially a Florida-based wrestling podcast. They do a better job of me of keeping up on the day-to-day stuff that's happening on screen, the pay-per-view results, things like that. Not my strong suit, obviously, because we have a lot of guests on the show. But we do get to it when we can. And of course, we talk about it a lot on the @Going Ringside TikTok and Instagram channel. But I reached out to the Chutes and Ladders Podcast, and I said, hey, I'd like to have you guys on the show. I want to talk about a few things. Like to learn who you are, let people know where to find you, because it's obviously a new wrestling podcast in our area. I also wanted to pick their brains about some things going on in WWE and AEW right now, so they were happy to come on, and I was happy to have them on. So here's our interview with brand new podcast based in Florida, where we're at. This is the Chutes and Ladders Podcast. Well, we're excited to be joined now by Desiree Josen, I think I got it right, and Jason Curavilla with the new Chutes and Ladders Podcast, all about wrestling. Both of you, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having us.
So tell me all about the show, you guys. I'm based in Jacksonville, Florida. You're half based in Jacksonville, Florida, but you're kind of a Florida-based wrestling podcast, but certainly there's no bounds in wrestling podcast world. So tell me all about the show.
Yeah, well, like I said, we're locals. I'm in Jacksonville, and Jason is in South Florida, and we've been friends for years, college friends from FSU, go Noles. And we have spent our friendship just texting back and forth with any kind of match, any kind of live event. And we're like, hey, this is pretty fun. I think we should turn this into a podcast. Other people would love it. And and here we are, just two wrestling fans talking about wrestling from today, where our storyline's going, our favorite pastime matches, anything.
And Jason, I want to ask you this a couple times, so let's start with you. Where do people find it? Where do they find out all about it?
Absolutely. So our Instagram is @the Chutes and Ladders. We are on Spotify. We're on YouTube as well. And it's @the Chutes and Ladders as well. The podcast, we have an audio podcast, which is on Spotify. We actually have a video show, which is on YouTube as well. Feel free to you feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And you can also email us at theshootsandladders@gmail.com with any type of questions or comments.
Jason, you were telling me you used to have you've been in media for a while in other roles, but of all the media roles you could do, wrestling podcast, how did that come to you?
So I used to be a video editor, for Fox Sports, and I was always behind the camera. I switched over to sales just for financial reasons, but I still had the love for being in media. I didn't know where it was going to go, to be completely honest with you. And then I knew I wasn't done editing. I love editing, so because I edit all the shows, it's fun for me. It allows me to be creative. I actually asked to be a part of other people's podcasts because I'm a huge college football guy, just a pro football guy. I just love sports. I kind of got the workaround. Yeah, we'll have you here and there, but nothing ever kind of solidified. So finally, I was like, what if I did something on my own? And Des and I talk about wrestling all the time. And I said, Des, what if we did our own podcast? I honestly thought she was going to say, haha, yeah, who knows, and whatever. But no, she's like, you're the fifth person that told me this. So it almost seems like we were destined to do so. One thing led to the other. And honestly, everything has kind of come together. And it's been such a fun ride, including, being honored to be a guest on your show. So this has been such an amazing ride.
Yeah, Desiree, I want to ask you, you fascinate me. So I've had a lot of podcasters from the wrestling world on my show, and they all are one gender. You're the first female. I've had plenty of females on the show, don't get me wrong, but you're the first female wrestling podcast host we've had on. Are you unique in the industry? Is there a lot out there?
I would think so. That's what I've been told. I know throughout the years, the female fan in wrestling has grown tremendously.
Sure. Yeah.
There is a higher presence, but I am a lifelong fan. I come from a family that has always loved wrestling. My mom used to go to house shows in the 70s with my granddaddy.
House shows. Oh, yeah. She was a diehard.
Oh, yeah. And then my brothers are a little bit older. So they were watching wrestling in the early 80s. I was born in 87. So I got the very tail end of, with Hulkamania and everything like that. But I grew up, just watching everything just from the start of the Attitude Era, which is something that's my favorite. And just watching the evolution of wrestling now. So I love it. I love everything about the business.
I want to pick your guys' brains on a few subjects, and I want to start with WWE. Later this year, my stations, we're going to have NXT. Raw is going to Netflix. SmackDown's moving off broadcast television. What are your kind of thoughts? And of course, UFC. Get to UFC in a bit. But what are your thoughts on where WWE is at right now? They're obviously going to go through a lot of changes over the next 6 months.
So I can start off, and I actually think they're in a much better place creatively, especially now with Paul Levesque, Triple H. He creatively, you can tell there's such a difference. It seems like, especially, there's more cohesion backstage. More people are on board. It seems like from storylines and purpose, there's a lot more freedom. It's not like someone's over their shoulder 24/7 where there's a bunch of rewrites. It doesn't seem as chaotic as it used to be. I honestly can't speak enough of just praise of Triple H, and the wrestlers are actually coming out and saying it too. So I think they're by far in the best position. And obviously they just got that $5 billion deal with Netflix. So I just think it's an upward trajectory.
Desiree, your thoughts? So one of the things that I'm seeing, particularly in the Netflix deals, it may get a little more adult themed, less bleeps like we see on cable.
Oh, I'm excited about that because I feel like we're going to get another Attitude Era. And it's already been said, this is the Paul Levesque era. And I feel like they can really be who they are. They don't have to censor. The storylines can be a little bit more, I guess, more competitive. And I know they were originally trying to more of the family audience. And now there's really no restrictions here. So it's really going to be no holds barred.
So, Desiree, I want to switch companies for a bit. And you're in Jacksonville, where obviously we were right across the river. My studio is from AEW headquarters. Mm-hmm. AEW, I just don't get the fans' obsession with criticizing them. I don't get it. It's online. It seems everywhere. But, people are talking about crowd sizes and whether they're doing well. What are your thoughts on the status of AEW right now?
I still think they're new and they're in their learning phase. And it's very reminiscent of WCW. When I watch a lot of their shows, I'm like, oh, this feels like Nitro. Anytime they're in town, I go to a live show and there are ups and downs when I see the audience. A lot of it could be just the oversaturation of, so much talent. They have so much potential. And like I said, I think it's a learning curve once they get the gist of proper bookings and having a hold of creative and really finding their groove, because they understand they're not trying to be WWE. They're not going to try to be that brand because that's a completely different level. I think this is I think AEW is a good promotion for the newer talent coming in to get their feet wet, and also for the older ones that are on their way of, out of retirement or into retirement, to help slow them down, go into coaching and producing. So I think I get the criticism, but they have a lot of potential.
Jason, one thing I don't get is they do have stars. I mean, they got Adam Copeland, they had Sting up until a couple months ago, Brian Danielson, and a lot of their MJF, obviously. I mean, it's not like they're lacking in star power. You know what I mean? That's what I don't get.
So I actually want to add something. And we've actually talked this about on our podcast. They're charging $50 per pay-per-view. Yeah. As an audience, we're under subscription fatigue. Most dollars, I'd say the average family or just adult, you have 2 subscriptions, whether it's Netflix or Hulu. Like realistically, your budget for about 2 subscriptions, I would say, right? And so a lot of people are subscribing to Peacock, which is a very minimal sum, but you get your PLEs. So for AEW to want the average fan to spend an additional $50, it's not happening. We're actually very vocal that we don't pay for it. We're not going to, and that's going to hurt them. The simple solution to this is they need to have their PLEs on the Max app. I think that's a huge, huge detriment. I don't think the average fan is actually buying these pay-per-views because they're just not going to do, who's going to spend $50 in addition to all the other subscriptions that they have? So that's the first thing I'll say. Now, going back to your point about the talent, yeah, I'm actually with you. They do have a lot of talent, but how are they using the talent and who's booking? If it's just one guy that is kind of breathing down everyone's neck saying, hey, this is what I want done, maybe some guys kind of have their hands tied. And I think a lot of people originally, when they jumped ship from WWE to AEW, they kind of were under the impression that they were given more creative freedom. And if they're not getting that, then you're going to see it reflect on the product.
One thing before we go on and get some long-term predictions here, looking forward to next year's WrestleMania, because we recently saw John Cena announcing he'll likely retire at next year's WrestleMania. So, last year there was a whole drama about, is it Cody and Roman? Is it Roman and Rock? And it just became this whole cluster. Where do you think main events are going to go going into Mania next year? Do you think it's going to be Rock at the center of it? Do you think Cena's retirement match? Any thoughts on where you see it's going? Desiree, let's start with you.
I think The Rock is coming back. I think because he didn't get this Mania's main event, I think he's guaranteed next year's main event.
Jason, how about you? Where do you see it going?
So the fact that they have 2 champions, they kind of have a little bit of flexibility. Yeah, I think The Rock's going to be the center. I have a wild card, and I think one thing that wrestling fans love the most is having surprises. I would love to see just a surprise, and I would love to see Sami Zayn win the Royal Rumble and headline for the other title shot. I think the crowd would absolutely explode. But yeah, I think The Rock will be the main event, but for the one title, but the other title, I would love to see Sami Zayn fight for it and actually win.
Well, Jason, Desiree, it's been a pleasure. Desiree, could you sign off and let me know one more time where people can find the show and all about you guys?
You can find us on Spotify and YouTube at the official Shoots and Ladders. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook. We are everywhere.
Well, Desiree, Jason Curavilla,
Shoots and Ladders podcast. Thank you guys for joining us on the show today.
So I want to thank the Shoots and Ladders podcast for joining us on the show today. We may bring them back on sometime. And of course, Glenn Jacobs, the mayor of Knox County, Tennessee, aka Cain. So glad he could be with us. As I said, watch what happens with the November election. You might get an idea what's going to happen with Glenn Jacobs in politics. And as I said, we've talked about politics a lot the last 3 weeks. We're going to kind of get away from that, back to normal. No politics, all wrestling. However, I will be at the Republican National Convention. Excuse me, I misspoke. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago in a few weeks. If anything that's of interest comes up that might belong here on Going Ringside, we'll of course bring it to you. So thank you for joining us for episode 75. I can't believe we've gotten this far. So glad you could be with us. We'll see you back here next time.
This has been Going Ringside with the local station, brought to you every Wednesday on your favorite podcast player, on News 4 Jax Plus, as well as the News 4 Jax YouTube channel.